Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, how's it going?
Going really well. Summer's moving along, having a great time, and got to read some fun comic books this week. Well, this year it's Marvel, and it's all about the cash grab starting for Marvel this year. We're going to get Secret Wars 2. We're going to get a bunch of sort of vaguely copyright infringing kids books to try and make their way into the kids space that's been opened up when they bankrupted all of the other comic companies. And we're going to get some fantastic Bill Sienkiewicz artwork that makes me forgive everything else that happens at Marvel this year. Because it's worth it. So, let's talk 1985 in comics. Marvel, Daredevil, the whole works.
Right. That sounds good. We've got a lot to talk about. But, Dan, you wanted to tell everybody that we are now on YouTube as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a, kind of a presence on a lot of the podcasting channels already. But Podbean, which is the software, the website we use to do our posting, actually does have an option for posting directly to YouTube as well. And so I've started turning that on and testing it. Seems to work well. So we're going to be posting our episodes out there as well. Now, they're still going to just be audio podcasts. But if, for whatever reason, it's easier to listen to them on YouTube instead of on your podcast feed, or if you know somebody you think might enjoy it that doesn't do podcasts but does occasionally have YouTube on in the background at work or whatever, feel free to let them know or to check it out yourself. So it's under Comics Over Time, right in YouTube. Just do a search. We should come up and you can find us.
Very, very cool. We've talked about doing that for some time, and I'm glad that Podbean made it easy enough that we could start doing that as well.
Yep, and then I guess the other thing, kind of wanted to just note, we got another note from Amanda this week. Good to hear from her again. Sounds like she has been following along and listening not only to our stuff, but then hearing about some of the Moon Knight MCU appearances that might be coming up and the like, much as we have. So I think there's a number of folks who've been with us from the Moon Knight days and the like who are similarly excited to hear that maybe some of this is going to get figured out. I'm hoping the Midnight Sun stuff is all going to work out the way we hope. But there have been so many sort of starts and stops with this Moon Knight MCU Odyssey. I'm almost afraid to even think about whether it's all going to actually happen. So
I feel like we're going to get some clarity at the San Diego Comic-Con because Marvel, and specifically the MCU, has Hall H, I think, reserved for an hour panel to talk about the MCU, which they did not do at least last year, and I think the last couple years. And so there's definitely some excitement that we're going to get some clarity on what projects are coming, when they're coming, and who might be involved in them. So we'll be watching it, and yes, I'm sure we'll be talking about it off and on as we move forward here over the next few weeks.
So if you hear any Ghost Rider news, evidently that's what Amanda's hoping for, is more Ghost Rider. So we'll see. That would be what we would expect with Midnight Suns, though, is if they're going to do that, it'd be really hard to do that without Ghost Rider. So,
the year in comics. All right, Dan, 1985, we're looking at comics in general, so we're not going to look at the 800-pound gorilla that is Marvel that seems to have been, having its way with the comic book industry over the last couple of years. Tell us, outside of Marvel, what's going on in comics this year?
So first off, to sort of put it in context of how little outside of Marvel means at this point, we had two things I think I can lead off with just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea where things are at. First off, we had Charlton, one of the longest running and most sort of storied of the remaining newsstand publishers, actually finally go out of business this year. So newsstand comic book industry is almost completely moribund. And if you aren't selling titles in the direct market right now, you're really not selling comic books. Second, talking to apocryphal information from a number of comics retailers, according to them, in many cases, in the direct market itself, Marvel was outselling DC by a range of something like 10 to 1 on a lot of the main titles at this point.
Wow.
So this was a time when DC had a lot of older artists like Don Heck and Carmen Infantino and guys like that writing their main books, their Superman books, their Flash books, etc. They didn't have a lot of new ideas. They didn't have a lot of new characters. They didn't have a lot of really sort of big artists and the like. Now they'd gotten some started. We talked about Alan Moore came in last year. They sort of stole Frank Miller over, that sort of stuff. But if you look at the stable overall of Marvel versus DC, DC is getting old, and their characters are generally considered to be a little bit stodgy, right? Like they're just old and kind of not all that interesting. And with the new sort of edgier feel that Marvel and a lot of the independents are going for, DC just was out of place in terms of being able to get the eyeballs and the attention and the interest of younger folks in America. So, what did they decide to do? They decided to blow everything up and start over. And this is the year, might as well, right?
Right.
This is the year that they actually came up with something called Crisis on Infinite Earths. And technically it had been planned for a while, because they hired a guy named Peter Sanderson and gave him the job of reading every DC comic book printed since 1935 and taking notes on them so that they could then know what they had for a continuity in terms of deciding what to break. But over the last 20 years, ever since the Flash of Two Worlds, DC had multiple universes. We had Earth 1, which is the Silver Age DC universe. We had Earth 2, which is the one that had all of the old Golden Age heroes on it, many of whom had gotten old now or died. Superman in the Golden Age universe of Earth 2 was married. Batman was already married and he died, and Huntress was his daughter who'd come in and taken over. Earth 3, you had sort of almost like anti-heroes for the Justice League. And then there were other Earths as well. And what they did is they said, we need to clean this up. And so in an event called Crisis on Infinite Earths, written by Marv Wolfman, drawn by George Perez, they essentially had an event that collapsed all of the multiverses back down into one through this massive battle between someone called the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor. And at the end of that, they then restarted the universe, essentially, with a new status quo. Some of the characters that had been on other Earths now were on the main Earth. Some of those characters were just gone. The Silver Age Flash died as part of the Crisis. Supergirl died as part of the Crisis. So Supergirl is a character who'd been around a long time, but hadn't been that particularly popular, especially recently. She'd had a movie that kind of flopped, and her book didn't necessarily sell all that well all the time. And so what DC did is they said, look, we want to have Superman again have that story of being the last Kryptonian, right? And to do that, we've got to get rid of all the other Kryptonians that have popped up over the last however long. Because we've got Kandor with a whole city of them, and we've got, all of the bad guys that have come back and everything else. And so we're going to go back to there just being one Kryptonian, and that being Superman. So they got rid of Crypto, and they got rid of the Super Horse and all of this sort of stuff along with it. This was a huge change. And it was traumatic a little bit because I, for instance, was a huge fan of the Earth 2 heroes. They were all suddenly gone, or they'd been folded into a new continuity. So now the World War II no longer had DC heroes the way that it had before. Because if there were heroes like Power Girl, who was an Earth 2 Golden Age hero, they were instead now brought up to modern day and brought into the regular universe instead. All in all, this was a really bold thing they did, kind of on the heels of Secret Wars. But it worked. A lot of people got angry, but it did reset them for a new generation of readers, and it also did clean up a lot of things and give them new space to tell stories. And so this was actually something that had been a long time coming. 7-issue series. George Perez drew the heck out of it. Sometimes there would be literally hundreds of characters in a single page. It was crazy.
That doesn't shock me in the slightest, having seen some George Perez book. So I guess the big question is did it work from the standpoint of, did it sell books?
It did, but actually the sales weren't as good as Secret Wars. But I think what it did is it cleaned out a lot of things that needed cleaning out.
Sure.
DC was in a rough spot, though, I think, is one of the reasons why it didn't sell as many as Secret Wars, is, as noted, DC just wasn't selling as much overall as Marvel. And so they weren't able to really get that going. From a quality perspective, I would say that everybody, especially in retrospect, would tell you that Crisis on Infinite Earths is a masterpiece and Secret Wars is a piece of trash.
Yeah. I was going to say, I don't remember us thinking too highly of Secret Wars when we were talking about it last week.
It's not good. And we'll find that the return to it this year is probably even worse. But lots of sales. So, sure. But this is something that DC needed to do, and it seemed to work.
Okay.
Outside of that, DC, because of that, had tons of changes. I'm not even going to try and talk about all of them, but just note that they basically flipped the entire house on its head this year. In terms of popular culture, there was actually a video release this year by a band called Aha. Went relatively well up the charts and was very popular on MTV, where the band and a girl from a diner sort of end up getting stuck in a comic book and running around through the panels and everything. That is a great music video. Fantastic video. And for comics fans like me, it was also cool because it was a very neat animated sort of nod to the comic books type of thing as well. So I really enjoyed that one. But
if you have not seen the video for the song "Take on Me," definitely go ahead and take a look at that, because it is visually stunning how it flows between like real life live action and then comic book art, and it just looks beautiful.
Yep, it's very cool. So that was this year, 1985. Over in the funny papers, we had quite possibly the most important debut since at least Peanuts and maybe since the invention of the comic strip. Calvin and Hobbes debuted in American papers.
There we go.
On November 18th of 1985, which I think, to me, is the greatest comic strip, at least of my lifetime, if not ever. And Bill Watterson's a genius. So, did you read much Calvin at all?
I would, I'm familiar with them, but no, I have to be, in all honesty, I have not read much in the way of Calvin and Hobbes. I hear it's fantastic. It wasn't something I looked at very much. And so I've seen like a strip here or there, but it isn't something that I've ever saw with any great length, or I haven't seen a bunch of it.
When I was a kid, my grandfather knew I liked comics, so he got the daily paper, and every day he would take the comics out of the daily paper when he was done and save them for me, so that if I didn't see them for a couple weeks or whatever, when I got to his house, he would have all of them for me. So I never really missed Calvin and Hobbes back in the day. And now I actually have the full sort of like bookshelf edition of all three of them. They are beyond compare, man. Awesome stuff. We also saw some pretty good stuff from another master of the genre. Will Eisner's The Dreamer came out, which was another of his series of graphic novels that came out in the 70s and 80s. And he also released something called Comics and Sequential Art, which was essentially a study he did detailing like how do panels work, how do comic storytelling elements work, all of that sort of stuff. This and Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, between them, to me, were sort of the primordial tools for understanding how a comic book worked under the hood. Really? And so, and McCloud, obviously, younger guy, he took a different look at it. But this is really a cool comic, or really a cool book. It's oversized, and it's got a lot of art in it and the like. But essentially, it's Will Eisner talking about what he knows about the comic book art form and how it works. And really, really a great read if you're interested in learning more about comics.
Cool.
Outside of that, we had a bunch of stuff that were not Calvin and Hobbes and Eisner, but were fun. So we had the debut of the Fish Police. We had the first issue of Miracle Man, which was brought over from England, essentially a reboot of something called Marvel Man, which was a reboot of Captain Marvel. This was written by Alan Moore and eventually Neil Gaiman. Still going now, actually. Marvel has gotten the rights to it since. These original ones were published in America by Eclipse. But very, very interesting story. Really well done. We had the first issue of Scout, something called Femforce, and a book I've always kind of had a soft spot for, Shatter #1, the first all-digital comic, came out this year. It was actually produced entirely on a first-generation Macintosh computer, using like Mac Paint or whatever the software for that was, pixel by pixel, with like one of those little weirdo mice that the early Macs had. And he created the whole thing and then printed it out on a Mac laser printer and then arranged it and got it set up. And then it was actually colored manually, which is interesting because for decades now, most comics, the art was produced traditionally on board, and then the inking and lettering, or for most traditional comics, you would see for the last couple of decades that the art is done essentially on board, right? The penciling and the inking, and then the lettering and the coloring would be done digitally. But Shatter actually upends that because the art was all digital and then the coloring was manual.
All right, so if there's not a lot going outside of Marvel, is there any other industry trends or anything that you want to note about comics in general?
In the big trends, I guess, we talked about Charlton throwing in the towel, but for the most part, other than that, it was a good year for publishers because we got a lot more of them coming in than we lost. Aircell started, Now started, Blackthorn, which was kind of like an outgrowth of the Pacific assets, started up. We got Sirius, and then a number of other smaller publishers. So you had the seeds kind of that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles sort of explosion. It's going to take a little while for all these companies to start really popping up, but you start seeing a few of them already this year. And then, I guess among other things, the Kirby Awards were instituted this year. So we do have an American Comic Book Awards list for the first time since like 1975.
I'm gonna say, yeah, it's been it's been around a decade or so, hasn't it?
Yep. And the Kirby Awards are eventually going to transfer into the Eisner Awards, or what's a better way to put it? The Eisner Awards pick up where the Kirby Awards leave off and essentially grandfather in all of their selections.
Gotcha. Do you want to tell us a few of those award winners for this first year?
Sure. So we did have the Eagle Awards and the Kirby Awards. Both of them picked Swamp Thing by Alan Moore, Bissett, and Toddleman as the best series. Kirby Awards also had Cerebus as the best black and white series, whereas the Eagle Awards picked American Flag Hard Times as the best graphic novel. Crisis on Infinite Earths won for best finite series or single comic for both of them, with Marv Wolfman and George Perez. Best new series for Kirby Awards was Scott McCloud's Zot. The best new title for the Eagle Awards was Miracle Man, which of course had a bit of a leg up because a lot of British folks really had been waiting for the return of Marvel Man, so they were pretty excited about that. Favorite writer, both the Eagle and the Kirby Awards picked Alan Moore. Favorite artist, George Perez was picked by the British fans, and Dave Stevens, just getting started out on the Rocketeer, was picked by the Americans on the Kirby side. So, a lot of good folks, really some good selections.
Yeah. So before we move on and talk about Marvel, what was your favorite comic outside of Marvel in 1985?
Crisis on Infinite Earths absolutely ruled the year. I mean, that thing was amazing. The art was fantastic. The story was crazy. I mean, the fact that they killed Supergirl and the Flash in consecutive months in issues 7 and 8, and you had universes and worlds just sort of disappearing in front of you. It was truly just epic at all levels. The art was there, the writing was there. It made me sad because I knew that there were things I really loved in the DC universe that were going away, and I did not know if they were coming back. But it still was the title that I was waiting for every month in at least outside of Marvel, where we'll talk about there's one book that I also really loved this year.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior.
All right, Dan, if like the big thing outside of Marvel was Crisis on Infinite Earths, what did Marvel have to go up against that as far as like big stories or even, I guess, just what were they doing to as like something else to go to look at if you were in the direct market and going to the comic book store and buying?
There's a couple different things, I guess, that were going on. The first thing is, as far as a direct competition to Crisis, you had Secret Wars 2, which was every bit as milquetoast and forgettable as the first Secret Wars. The art wasn't great, the story wasn't great, but what they did do is they decided that this time they were going to cross over into all the titles. So if you remember with Secret Wars 1, heroes disappeared, came back the next month, and then their titles continued. Now what we're having instead is the Beyonder drops down on Earth and starts wandering into other people's titles left and right, besides having his own miniseries. And so if you wanted to buy like the whole Secret Wars 2 series, it would cost you like $30 with all of the comics you needed to purchase, which at that time was a fantastic amount of money. And so it was really obviously just a cash grab. It was not a good story. And to the absolute shame of everybody who was a comic fan at that time, it sold ridiculously well again. So we taught Marvel all the wrong lessons, right? It sold fantastically. All of the books that they crossed over into, when there was a Secret Wars crossover, the book sold better that month, and it was just a disaster. So that was terrible.
We'll talk. Sorry, we'll talk about the fact that there was a Daredevil issue this year that featured the Beyonder in it. And like nothing about him leading up to it. Then there's an issue where he is in there and things are going on. And then suddenly the next issue, completely gone. Nobody's talking about it anymore.
Yep, that is correct. So that was that. Secret Wars again kind of dominated the year at Marvel in that way. We've got the Heroes for Hope benefit book, though, that came out. Bernie Wrightson and Jim Starlin were sitting around visiting one day, like they do, and decided that seeing some of the various benefits that, like, musicians were putting on for famine relief in Africa and the like, that they wanted to do something as well. They called Jim Starlin. He said, "Yep, sure. You get people to donate the talent. We'll donate all the profits." And so they did. And they put out a book. It was 48 pages, over 100 creators, many of them comic creators, but also people like Stephen King, who evidently submitted a comic strip that was entirely undrawable, because it would have been, he had 3 pages and he submitted 3 pages he thought that would have taken like evidently 18 to 20 pages to draw or something like this. So there weren't, but nonetheless, they got Stephen King to help out with this. Lots of famous folks that were writers from outside the industry, most of the greatest artists in comics, and really successful. Made like $500,000 for the charity that they ended up donating to, and inspired another book, a similar one at DC, sometime later this year or early next year. Other than that, as far as storylines, we had the trial of Magneto in X-Men number 200. That actually, if you watched the X-Men 97 animated series on Disney Plus, the one that they just started up again this year, that actually adapts the trial of Magneto in this year's episodes. So they got to that there. Death of Jean DeWolf was a big story that went on in Spider-Man. Tony Stark comes back as Iron Man in issue number 200. We get a book called Marvel Saga that actually tells the story of the Marvel Universe chronologically from an in-universe standpoint. So we find things out, like when actually the first of these things happened, and how some of the, what happened with the Celestials, what happened with the Eternals, what happened with this, etc. So it was one of the first attempts to really sort of go in and take Marvel's convoluted continuity of the last 30 years and tell it as a single ongoing story. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
Something would probably be almost impossible today with another 35 years
I was
of
going
baggage.
to say.
But at that time, it was rough.
Yeah. It seems difficult, but not impossible. Now it feels like it might be actually impossible to do.
It would be pretty impossible. But you never know. They may try it sometime. We had a couple changes. One big change in terms of creators. John Byrne actually left Alpha Flight that he'd been writing and drawing, and took over the Hulk. He actually traded with the creative team on the Hulk. They weren't happy doing Hulk stuff anymore. He wasn't happy doing Alpha Flight stuff, so he just traded him. And Starlin said, "Sure, whatever you guys want to do." So the John Byrne books are pretty good.
Is that common? Does that happen?
Not even remotely. No,
Okay.
No, that is pretty uncommon. The idea that guys are leaving books on a regular basis, yeah, but the teams actually just swap with each other is very uncommon. Very uncommon.
Okay.
So, plus, it's not normally their choice, right? Like, normally people aren't going like, "Hey, I'll take Hulk from you." Starlin would be like, or Jim Shooter would be like, "No, I will tell you which books you're going to be on. No,
right.
you're doing this." But
right.
And then lastly, we're going to see that Star Comics expands. There were 13 new Star Comics, the children's titles this year. Wally the Wizard, Planetary, Top Dog, Fraggle Rock, Strawberry Shortcake, The Ewoks, The Get Along Gang, Muppet Babies, Peter Porker, The Spectacular Spider Pork, or Spectacular Spider Ham, or whatever, Royal Roy, Care Bears, Thundercats, and Heathcliff. So, of our new ongoing series, like over half of them are kids' titles.
Okay.
Which I think tells you that even as Marvel is looking at the direct market as its salvation and seeing that it needs to, to sort of serve that market to survive, there may somewhere in the back of their minds be alarm bells going off for some of the folks at Marvel where they're like, I don't see any 6-year-old kids reading comic books anymore.
Right.
I don't see the next generation running around with a Marvel comic ever. And so this was an attempt to sort of do something about this. All these are going to go mostly into the newsstand market, not so much at direct sales. Many of them fail, but Thundercats actually goes 24 issues, and Heathcliff, of all things, lasts for 5 years. It gets 56 issues in. So, but a lot of them did go quickly, partly because Harvey sued them or threatened to sue them over a number of them, because things like Royal Roy is simply a ripoff of Richie Rich, like almost note for note. It's just there's so many of these that are just blatant infringing type of things.
Sure.
So
and some of these are licensed too, because like Fraggle Rock
Yep.
and Muppet Babies and Strawberry Shortcake and those are presumably licensed.
absolutely, Care Bears. So there were a number of
Okay.
those that they did kind of in association with somebody too. But so that was basically it. There wasn't a lot of real, considering there were 58 new titles this year. There wasn't really that much new going on, considering there were like 150 total titles. There wasn't that much 125 total titles. There wasn't that much interesting going on, which is kind of sad. So, at least long term.
So outside of those Star comics, the younger comics, was there anything of any real consequence that came out this year, that started this year anyway?
Absolutely. Quite a few of them. Just not as many as you'd think with 58 titles. So
Right.
the longest running series that debuted this year is Web of Spider-Man, which is a third Spider-Man book. They canceled Marvel Team Up, which was the one where Spidey would team up with another Marvel hero every month. And they brought out Web of Spider-Man instead as just a solo book that sort of concentrated on Peter Parker and really more of his day job kind of thing. It was more of a Spider-Man workplace book, at least at first. We had... Oh, go ahead.
So it is what? Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Web of Spider-Man then? Are those the three
Amazing
titles?
Spider-Man, Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, which is, Spectacular Spider-Man, but it's actually technically Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, and now Web of Spider-Man.
Gotcha. I was just trying to see if I could remember what those three titles would be.
And then we'll be adding to them soon. So
Sure.
and then Epic had Gru the Wanderer. Sergio Aragones had brought his title to a few different places, but finally came to agreement in trusting that Marvel would not try and steal his creation if he worked with them through Epic. And so once they got going, it was a relatively successful partnership. Went for 120 issues. So essentially a decade. Gru was published under the Marvel Epic banner. West Coast Avengers went for 47 issues. Elf and Moon Knight, of course, was a part of that for a while. So we read some of them back when we were doing the Moon Knight podcast. ElfQuest was published by Epic, and it went 32 issues, which was basically reprinting the entire ElfQuest run at that time. Marvel Saga was the one that was the retelling of the Marvel history. That went 25 issues. And then Epic had a series called Swords of the Swashbucklers that went 12. Cloak and Dagger got their own series after the successful miniseries that went 11. And then there's a bunch of stuff that didn't last, that went 5, 6, 8 issues, whatever. Then we had the limited series, of course. I don't want to talk about all of them, but there's so many, right?
Is there a couple that you'd want to spotlight or tell us tell us about?
In terms of the ones I liked, the Balder the Brave series was a Thor spinoff. That was really good. Black Dragon had John Bolton art. I really liked that. Dreadstar and Company was a reprint of some of the Dreadstar stuff that had been done by Jim Starlin that was then put into kind of the direct market again. Gargoyle was a really interesting story. I like that one. Longshot, of course, came out with Ann Nocenti and Arthur Adams and was probably my favorite miniseries of the year. Murata the She-Wolf was kind of a sword and sorcery one that was pretty good. Moon Knight got his second series as a miniseries. That was also pretty decent. Rocket Raccoon was better than you maybe think. Yep, what's that?
No, Moon Knight. This would be that volume 2, right?
Volume 2, yep.
It was like 6 issues, if I remember right.
Correct, and it was designed as a limited series. So I believe it's one that if we had a way of doing it like that now, maybe it would have been designed as a more free-flowing, where if the sales were there, it would have continued on. But as it was, this was just designed as a 6-issue series, and so that's what it closed up as. So,
yeah.
Secret Wars 2, of course, came out and was awful, and everyone loved it, or at least bought it, and then complained about it. 6 from Sirius 2, Paul Galassi art, fantastic. First Squadron Supreme miniseries. If you remember, the Squadron Supreme is the one that eventually the author has his blood mixed in with the printing ink for the reprint.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Starstruck had some absolutely fantastic Kaluta artwork on it. That was an X-Men or an epic title. And then X-Men Alpha Flight was absolutely beautiful. I loved that book. So that was I think a 2-issue series, but really good stuff. So, yeah, a lot of good stuff that came out. But not really that much new. It wasn't like a lot of new heroes or things like that. It was just solid content using a lot of the characters that were already there in ways that didn't necessarily change them permanently a whole lot.
That's true. Okay, so then we didn't get much in the way of new characters then this year?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is the weakest year of new characters we've ever seen.
Okay.
So, not to say that none of these people did anything, but in looking, I found my top 7 or 8, right? Silver Sable comes in, and she's had a number of books. She's kind of an anti-hero, bounty hunter, vigilante type. She's in Spider-Man villain, an occasional, romantic interest. Firestar, who debuted actually in the animated series, the cartoon series, comes in X-Men. Flag Smasher, who we see in the Captain America or the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV series. Flag Smasher was the antagonist in that. He came in there. Flag Smasher, I believe, in the show is a girl. Legion comes in New Mutants number 25 and becomes a very important character. Legion actually probably is one of the more powerful characters in the entire Marvel universe, in fact, but has also always been a really weird character that's been kind of a niche utilization. We got Longshot and Mojo, and of course Ricochet Rita, introduced in the Longshot miniseries that came out. Nimrod is going to become one of the biggest villains for the X-Men. And my number 8 selection is Sharon Ventura, who's a wrestler who for a time turns into a she-thing and kind of is a thing character. and it astonishes me.
This isn't like a murderer's row, so to speak, of heroes and villains for the year. I've heard of a couple of these, but most of these feel like they're pretty deep cuts.
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing is that, Silver Sable's probably the most utilized character that was introduced this year, but she's never really been in any of the other media, so I don't know that she's got that much name recognition outside of comics themselves and outside of Spider-Man fandom. It's a really thin group, and this probably, again, we're starting to see that whole creator-owned thing, that fewer and fewer creators are willing to give away good characters to Marvel. Because if they've got a good character, they're going to keep them and take them over into another series and make money off them themselves.
All right, so 58 new series across Marvel. What about things that might be ending this year?
Not much. Marvel's doing pretty well. We only lost 3 series that had been published more than 10 issues. Marvel Team Up ended at 150, and again, that really wasn't canceled. They just wanted to get everybody else out of the way and just Spider-Man to the
focus on Spider-Man
to the fore. So that essentially is just replaced by Web of Spider-Man. Crystar the Crystal Warrior ends at number 11. And I remember the covers for this were fantastic, but the stories inside were not good. So I think that died a death of just not being quality. And Cull the Conqueror made it 10 issues and then ended. And other than that, most of the things that ended were miniseries or the like that just were kind of naturally going to end.
Sure. All right, so what does the bullpen look like at this point then?
So the bullpen, again, we had 125 titles that we were publishing. The staff size is right around 325, so it's up a little bit from last year, but not a whole lot. Jim Shooter is still the editor-in-chief. And because our podcast has increasingly been adding things, I'm going to take out, dear listeners, the listing of who was the highest rankings as far as writer, artist, etc., because they don't change that often and haven't seemed all that particularly useful to us. So if it's okay with you, Dwayne, I think we just proceed to the Rookie of the Year.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about the new people then. Who is new at Marvel that we should take note of, and who gets the coveted Rookie of the Year title for 1985?
So the crazy thing is there were 105 new people at Marvel this year, which is kind of ridiculous. Part of that is because a lot of them come in with the Care Bear line, right? So there's a lot of people who'd previously been drawing Power Man and Iron Fist that were not necessarily temperamentally designed for Heathcliff. And so if they're going to do all of these new Starline comics, they needed to find people who are going to do that sort of art. And in fact, the people they brought in to do the knockoff Royal Roy comic actually were the same people who'd been drawing Richie Rich for Harvey for years. So they didn't do themselves any favors with that either. They're just like, come over here and do what you've been doing just at our company. So I found only 3 of these folks, though, that really I think I would say have a long time strong influence on Marvel. One of them I assume is a typo, but I can't prove that. So maybe it's just that, I don't know, his dad worked at something and he got to do it for fun. Phil Lord is in the system doing inking for a Marvel book in 1985. And it also has him on Spider-Verse titles in like 2022 or whatever, right? So Phil Lord is one half of the duo that did the Spider-Verse movies.
Yeah.
Obviously, and he would have been 10 years old in 1985 because he was born in 1975. If this is the same Phil Lord, he obviously has a pretty good pedigree in terms of long-term effect for Marvel because he made the Spider-Verse movies, which are fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume something is messed up in the comics.org database and that a 10-year-old kid was not actually inking for Jim Shooter in 1985. So I'm disqualifying him, and if I'm wrong on that, somebody let me know. The other 2, and this is a weird situation, the other 2 people we have to choose between are Todd McFarlane, who really only worked for Marvel from 1987 to about 1991. But during that time, he was an absolute, hurricane. Not just in terms of what he did, but in terms of the attention he brought to Marvel and the excitement he brought to Marvel.
This is the Todd McFarlane, right? The guy that's behind all of the figurines and has done a bunch of other
McFarlane
stuff
Toys,
outside. Yeah.
the guy who paid $1 million for Mark McGuire's home run ball, that sort of stuff. Yes, this is that Todd McFarlane. He started out actually as a failed baseball player, in fact, because the reason why he became a superstar comic book artist is because he couldn't keep his batting average up enough in the minor leagues to make an actual major league roster. And eventually he was sort of out of options for baseball, both the time that he was finishing up college with his art degree and he went to DC, started doing some stuff. He came over to Marvel in 1987, took over the Hulk book, worked on that for a while. Then he moved over and took over Spider-Man and had a really, really important run on Spider-Man. And then actually relaunched Spider-Man with a new Spider-Man title, just called Spider-Man. There's no question that he made Spider-Man cool again, or cooler again, or whatever, in the 80s. But he also does not have a long-term pedigree, and he then left to form Image, and really has never looked back. I don't think he has done anything for Marvel in the last 20, 30 years. He hasn't really done much for comic art in general in the last 30 years, because, like you say, he moved into toys, and when he went to Image, he founded a book called Spawn that he wrote and drew for a little while. And then, since then, he's been writing that with other people, including Greg Capullo as the artist. That is really the only comic book he continues to do. Most of his other efforts now are in other things. And because of that, I'm actually going to choose for my Rookie of the Year, Peter David. And Peter David is somebody who's been writing for Marvel for a long time. He may be the best Hulk writer who's ever worked for Marvel. He's also worked on a number of other books. He helped co-create Spider-Man 2099. He had a really long run on Wolverine and has worked on all sorts of other stuff. And he's just been a fantastic creator and creative force for Marvel for a long time. It's also interesting that we're now getting to the point where we're finding people whose careers aren't done yet. Right?
Right.
So, I mean,
yeah.
Todd McFarlane could decide tomorrow he's going to come back and draw comic books for the next 30 years, and I'm going to look pretty silly with this pick, right? But as of their current work, McFarlane, there's no question, is fantastic. But he really didn't, when you go in and look, he really didn't do that much stuff. And I think Peter David overall has a stronger case in terms of his long-term impact on Marvel. And the fact that he didn't desert Marvel to go and, start a rival company that then stole all of its best talent away. So that probably also is...
There is that too, yes.
But Jim Lee's probably going to win a Rookie of the Year without any problem, and he did the same thing. So we'll see how this goes.
Yes. All right. Well, congratulations to Peter David for winning the Rookie of the Year for 1985. Dan, before we start talking about Daredevil, what was your favorite Marvel comic in 1985?
This was the year when everything changed for me. So it's weird because when I read through some of the comic creators of the 60s and 70s, I'm doing a lot of study now on some of the underground cartoonists or the guys who broke into comics in the 60s and 70s. You hear them talking about reading Kurtzman's Mad magazine and how it just sort of blew their mind and opened sort of their perspectives on what a comic book should be and how this should work. Or, people who in the 60s would see Jack Kirby's stuff and just like, man, this is not like anything I ever thought a comic book could be. To me, New Mutants number 18 through 30 by Bill Sienkiewicz and Chris Claremont is that. I think I noted probably last year that when Sienkiewicz started, I didn't necessarily like it immediately. Like the first story arc he did was the Demon Bear arc, and I was drawn to it, and I knew there was something cooler about that than anything I'd ever seen. But it also just didn't really work for me, because I'm like, this is so experimental, it's so sketchy. You had to really decipher in many cases what was going on, because he abstracted everything. And the action became just these crazy sort of like kinetic lines, and a lot of times the figures themselves just got abstracted in weird ways that made no sense. By about issue 20 or 21, I was just on board, and I'd realized that Bill Sienkiewicz was just doing stuff that nobody else understood in terms of how to tell stories, right? And so I loved those books. I just waited every month to see what new craziness Sienkiewicz had in store for us. And we'd seen this kind of coming, because if you remember, like, the Hit Me story from, I think it was issue number 25 of Moon Knight and the like, he was starting to go a little bit off the rails from his sort of almost like a Neil Adams clone type of initial style as he hit the late part of Moon Knight. But New Mutants just exploded under him. And there is nothing like it. I still go in sometimes and I'm like, I can't believe he was allowed to do this in a mainstream comic book, because sometimes it just made no sense. But it was fantastic. So, absolutely fantastic. Yeah.
So would you say that this is kind of where that appreciation for Bill Sienkiewicz started? Was this, and then it kind of rolled back into Moon Knight and that sort of thing?
No, I was a huge Neil Adams guy and George Perez guy, like classic, very linear, very almost like Renaissance type painting kind of comic art, right? And that's what Sienkiewicz was starting out. He had this very solid, he was kind of a mixture of Kirby and Adams, where he'd have these big foreshortened arms coming out, and he'd do the big billowy cape, and basically was just copying Neil Adams' Batman as Moon Knight for a while. But why he was doing that, I think, was he was just developing his style and figuring out who and what he wanted to be. And then when he made that change, I hated it because I loved Bill Sienkiewicz's art, right? The way he did stuff in issues 15 to 25, even later in Moon Knight, the cover of Scarlet and the like, he started doing things crazy, but it still looked fantastic and very realistic, even with all the colors and some of the flourishes. New Mutants just does away with all of that. And so I hated them, because I'm like, what happened to my favorite artist, right? And I had to just kind of get back on to understanding what he was doing. And then I'm like, okay, this is weird. And I sometimes miss the guy who just pretended to be Neil Adams. But
okay. God,
is this fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was kind of appreciating the new look, I guess, of Bill Sienkiewicz.
Yeah, it took a while, because he really significantly changed the way he did his art style. And it was, he changed his medium. He started doing a lot of stuff that looked more like watercolors and really sort of like quick brushwork and stuff like this. It just looked completely different than what it was before.
Very cool.
Completely changed what I thought was possible in a comic book. And always appreciate that.
Yeah. Year in Daredevil.
All right, Dwayne. So, looks like this year we've got appearances in Daredevil from 214 to 225. He was in Fantastic Four 281, Marvel Tales 181, Spectacular Spider-Man had a couple of appearances, 108 and 109, and Marvel Fanfare, our old friend, number 23. What do you want to talk about with these, and what was Mr. Matt Murdock up to in 1985?
Sure. It's an interesting year. We left last year Frank Miller after those first couple books, and we had Denny O'Neil kind of jump in after a little bit of. I think there was a few other writers that also had some work. This year was, I think, a little bit of a transition in that it's primarily Denny O'Neil that does the writing across the main Daredevil title. He actually does all but two of the books, and in one of the books that he does do, he got a Jim Shooter worked with him, issue 223. But we also had the return of Frank Miller this year for one book that I think is really interesting that we're going to talk about after a little bit. And then Jim Owsley did issue 224. As far as pencilers go, we had David Mazzucchelli did most of the books. Sal Buscema, John Buscema, and then Dan Jurgens and Geof Isherwood did the three other books he didn't. And David Mazzucchelli also did most of the inking this year, with the exception of 3 books there as well. And the year is basically the ending of, I think, 1984, because we had, if you recall, we had that Micah Synn story that was on again, off again throughout like the entire year of 1984. We had an end to that, and actually a very quick end to that, in that it basically was just the January issue, where we see Synn is weakened and running for his life. Daredevil saves Synn from Kingpin's men and some homeless men before Synn himself starts asking for help, and Daredevil gives it to him, and that's basically it. I don't know what I was expecting, given that big long storyline we had in 1984, but this was kind of anticlimactic, if I'm being perfectly honest. It just sort of was like he was on the run, and then it just sort of ended.
Yeah, it seems like Denny O'Neil basically was not interested in whatever it was that previous guys had been trying to tell, and he's like, let's just wrap this up. But it also was interesting how there was an obvious sort of understanding that nobody knew what was going on with this. They're like, let's go back and tell you the base beats of what's happened over the last 15 issues.
Yeah.
Off and on. Because it's like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then essentially he gets beaten up by a bunch of homeless guys and asks Daredevil for help, and Daredevil feels bad for him. And then scene, and Denny O'Neil does not have to talk about it anymore. You know? It was weird. To be perfectly frank, I'm kind of was just sort of glad that it was over with by the time I ended the issue. It was just like, I think okay. That's one of the things that a good writer can maybe also understand, is when a story isn't going anywhere and it's best to just cut your losses. And I think that's what O'Neil ended up doing. That there was nothing about this that was making anybody happy, so let's just move on. And so that's what they did.
Yeah. So next there was this interesting, if not confusing, Western-inspired story taking place in 2 different places at 2 different time periods that seemed to have a connection with Daredevil. We had this story from like the Old West in Arizona in like the 1800s, and then we had this like more current story, and Dan, I'm going to be honest, I didn't really understand.
Yeah, I think essentially this comes down to kind of the idea that almost there's some sort of psychic link between this red-haired lawyer detective who is also a vigilante in the Old West and our friend, the red-haired lawyer vigilante who is now functioning in modern-day Marvel Universe. And so between them, like, he has a dream that he shares with this guy from back in the Old West, and then he decides he has to go out to the West, and it was weird. This is a very comic book story, though. I mean, it didn't even occur to me to question it, because it's like, yeah, Daredevil just has a weird dream, and that forces him to go out to the Old West, and then he finds a Grover Cleveland document or something that prevents a nuclear plant from being built by the bad guy, and it was a little strange. It was a little strange. So
I wish I could say it was the only story this year that kind of had me confused, but we're going to get to another one a little bit later on. Before that, though, we get another story featuring the Gale, who is that enforcer for the IRA. But we also learned in that story that Gloriana, the new love interest of Daredevil, is working for the IRA as the Old Woman of Bear. So it was really interesting. There was just like, it's like, oh, hey, let's jump and let's talk about the Gale and Gloriana and all this sort of thing, which was one of those sort of side stories, tangent stories, I would say, that we had last year in 1984. Don't know that it really did anything as far as moving any sort of long-term story on, but it was just, oh, hey, this is a thing, and there we go. The next story, though, is really fun because we get a story with the Jester who breaks out of prison just so that he can kidnap a noted actor and take that actor's place in a TV production of Cyrano de Bergerac. In the story, we see Daredevil dress up as the Jester and lead police around as a distraction, allowing the Jester to finish his flawless performance of Cyrano de Bergerac. Dan, this is a ridiculous story, and one where the cover of this book has basically Daredevil in the Daredevil costume, dressed up as the Jester. And at one point we have him leading the police around thinking that they're going to apprehend the Jester. Also that the actual Jester can continue mesmerizing the TV crowd by his rendition of Cyrano de Bergerac.
And not mesmerizing in the Mesmero kind of insidious thing. Somehow it appears in the last 100 and some issues, the Jester has actually learned to act. Because if you remember, it was Cyrano that he got laughed off the stage on back in the old days. He was a terrible actor. And now evidently he is so good that essentially Daredevil is sitting there going, I would be robbing the people of America of this performance if I allow the police to arrest the Jester before he's been able to finish the play, that he kidnapped the guy who was supposed to be doing the play so he could take his place. So he's essentially helps him finish off the crime that he started because he just did such a good job at it. He's like, yeah,
he is literally an accomplice to a kidnapping, basically in this thing.
Yep.
And to be fair, Jester, as soon as the performance is done, he's like, okay, I'll go back to prison now. Yep. I just wanted to do this thing.
Recognizes that Matt's done him a solid, and he's like, hey, that's really all I needed. I'm here, officers. So it's crazy, but I mean, kind of like the Two Gun Kid story. It's ridiculous, but it's a one and done story.
Yeah.
It's got a cool kind of twist. These stories are fun, just interesting stories. And they give us a slightly different perspective on characters than maybe we would have had before. So I liked them. I think especially considering the chaos of last year, just some nice professionally done goofy one-off stories is fine by me.
Agreed. So next we get this really fascinating story from Frank Miller in which Matt Murdock doesn't actually appear as Daredevil at all, nor does he even speak during the issue. This was really something. And I don't really know a good way of explaining what's going on. I would just say it's worth a read. It is issue 219, and it's great.
Just admit you don't know what's going on. You didn't. You didn't actually
I didn't.
I'm not really sure I understood what was going on either. It was very strange. It was very kind of the idea that the whole thing is this story basically where, what's this guy's name? The whole thing is basically evidently Daredevil, and I don't know if he accidentally wanders into this or whatever, but that there was this town where there was one good cop and he gets murdered evidently. And then his girlfriend, who's evidently now works at the bordello or something, because all Frank Miller's women from this point forward pretty much are going to work in a brothel, because that's just the way Frank rolls. But she's mourning him, and then there's the other cop who's dirty, and then this weird old lady who beats up everybody, and it literally ends with the one guy getting shot who's trying to help, and then him driving a motorcycle into a car with everybody else, and they all pretty much die, I would assume, because it's a massive flame, or did they walk away? I can't remember.
You got me at this point. I don't know. It was the fact that it was just so different and weird, and like I said, we don't see Daredevil. This is a Matt Murdock story, and then he doesn't even speak throughout this thing. There's other people that are speaking, but and you see him, he just doesn't say anything.
Yep, and it actually is. It's a cool story. It's a very Sin City story.
Yes.
Like, this is a story that would fit perfectly with like Marv in Sin City a few years from now. So if you just took Daredevil out and put Marv in and everybody dies, it's just a regular Sin City type of story. So, but that is weird because Marv and Daredevil are very different characters. So
they are. Yes.
They didn't inhabit the same role. So
right.
Anyway.
So next we get a tragic end to a longtime character in the book. This is going to be our spotlight story for this week, so I am not going to spend any more time right now talking about it. But the follow-up to this story takes Daredevil and Matt Murdock to Venice, Italy, in which he succeeds in getting the patents back, but it doesn't help his feelings of guilt. And like I said, we'll explain exactly what that means in just a little bit. Next, we have the Mudd brothers kidnap Gloriana, and Daredevil and Black Widow come to her rescue. So apparently, like all of Matt's other love interests, we get the girlfriend getting kidnapped, and him having to go and rescue her. Next, we get a tie-in to Secret Wars, which features a character called the Beyonder that, in all honesty, didn't make any sense to me at all. This is that book that, again, was part of Secret Wars 2, that like one issue there's no talk of the Beyonder, then all of a sudden we have the Beyonder, and all this stuff seems to be going on that seems to tie to something else that we don't know about. And then the book ends and suddenly everything's right back to where it was before. Nothing really makes any sense. Yeah, I'm going to tell you, I didn't like it. I felt confused the whole time, and that's like the third book now this year that had me that way.
Yeah, I actually did enjoy these books more, but I think I maybe have just got a switch in my brain where when comic books do comic book things, I just kind of accept it and don't worry about it as much as, because yeah, I can see obviously where they don't make sense when you mention it, but it didn't occur to me as I was reading them for the most part, which is kind of weird. I think I've just gotten to the point where I've read so many comic books that worrying about whether they all make sense is just it's too much to do. So
I have a hard time when there's just this. It's one thing when there's a story that is like a single kind of encapsulating story where it feels like there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, I can get behind that. It's these stories where I'm dropped, parachuted into what feels like the middle of the story, and I'm not given the beginning, I'm not given the end, and I'm not even necessarily given the middle. I'm just given like this small slice of the story, and then I'm just sort of left. By the time that book is over, I'm just sort of left with lots of questions, and then I get no answers in the follow-up books, and it's just like it would be it would be easy for me to go find answers now, but it would be like really difficult for me if I was reading this back in 1985, where there is no internet, there is no digital comics, there is no anything that would allow for me, other than going to a comic book store and trying to look at a whole bunch of other, Secret Wars 2 books, I wouldn't have any way of really figuring out what was going on.
And this is the constant problem that Marvel and most comics had back then, was Stan Lee had this dictum that every comic book is somebody's first comic book. And because of that, you couldn't make a book that wasn't enjoyable and understandable standing on its own. And it had to either have some sort of a quick intro or the ability to be a story where there was an enjoyable story chunk there, even if you'd never read the book before it and weren't going to read the book after it. As they get into the digital or into the direct market age, Marvel starts to play a little faster and looser with this. And you get more and more books that really don't make any sense if you haven't read the rest of the Secret Wars saga, or you don't know what's going on in the Marvel Universe. And that's, in some ways, a strength, because it allows you to tell deeper stories, because you're not always trying to catch people up. But it's also a weakness in that if you do get people who are trying to onboard, they can be really lost.
Yeah. With that, then, the year ends with Daredevil taking on a new villain, the Satyrian, and returning a locket to a blind man, and then taking on another Spider-Man villain, the Vulture. In that final book, there's an epilogue to the Black Crow, which was never followed up on. So there's a fair amount of things that go on this year. It just, like I said, there was a lot that kind of left me a little confused as to what it was I was reading or what I was supposed to get out of it, I guess. Oh, definitely been years that I've enjoyed more than this one, but there was still some interesting things here. I will say that.
I really enjoyed this year. I thought, now partly that's because David Mazzucchelli is David Mazzucchelli on full blast in these books. Like a lot of the things that I complained about last week about the books he was doing in 1984, I can't see anything but brilliance in the art that he's doing this year. It's amazing to me how a lot of his panels and his story choices were sort of almost robotic last year. He used a lot more panels, and a lot of his actual staging of his characters and the like was more static. Everything flows, and he's got these brilliant splash pages, and he uses fog and rain and all of this stuff so effectively now. It's just like a completely different artist.
I was going to say, definitely the Spotlight book that we're going to talk about, I would wholeheartedly agree with you, because I think the look and feel of that book is really, really interesting and special. Not just throughout it, but to your point, I do think this was a very good looking year of Daredevil. Like it definitely, even if the story was confusing to me, I still found it visually interesting to look at the page, and the panels, whether it was action sequences or just characters interacting, I thought was very interesting throughout the year.
Exactly. Even like the Western story we kind of started off with, it might have been a little bit less than fantastic in terms of some of the story elements, but it looked so good, and everything just flowed so well, and it had a great sort of just ambient feel about it that I didn't care. I was on board. So yeah, I think that he really ratcheted it up. And it's interesting because when we first looked at the stuff last week, as I was reading through that, I'm like, I wonder if somehow Mazzucchelli needs Frank Miller to sort of come in and, it's working with him that unlocks that. And it turns out, no, it wasn't. He just unlocked it himself the next year. It just took him a little time,
Just needed a little time, yeah.
And Denny O'Neil is also a really good person probably to work with on some of this stuff because he'd been an editor for a long time. He'd been a writer with some of the best artists in comics for years. And I suspect he also helped him just kind of work on his pacing and get some of this figured out. But a lot of it just looks like it's literally just Mazzucchelli figuring out who he is and starting to get down the style that he wants to use. So it's very impressive.
As far as the what's new this year, Daredevil goes to Venice, Italy. So we see for an issue, we see some different locales there, as well as the Old West, Arizona, in that Western story that we talked about early on in the year. As far as new supporting characters or interesting characters, that two-gun kid is from the Western story was kind of the character that had that link to the modern day Daredevil, Matt Murdock. Then we had Abraham Walker, who was the blind man at the end of the year who got his locket returned to him. That actually it was a little kind of sad because he lost this prize locket because of the Satyrian, and Daredevil gets it back and he gives it to him, and he's so excited. And then we find out that he thinks that there's a picture of his wife, his long deceased wife, in there, but it's actually an empty locket. There is no actual picture in there, but because Abraham Walker is blind, he doesn't know that the picture's not in there. So that was kind of interesting and sad a little bit.
Yep.
As far as new villains, we had the Cossack, who was another villain that tries to blind people, which doesn't work particularly well when your hero is blind and using a radar sense to beat you up. We had the Council of 10 and Emilio Royce, the Mud Brothers, and the Satyrian. It was the new guy new villain near the end, and obviously the Vulture as well. But he was a Spider-Man villain, and he even talked about the fact that, like, again, it's interesting when the Spider-Man villains make an appearance in the Daredevil comic, they're always comparing Daredevil to Spider-Man and being like, yeah, you're no Spider-Man, but, I'm here, so I might as well try and take you down as a result of this.
Yep. A-list villains slumming it with the B-list characters. That's the way it goes.
All right, Dan, I think that wraps up the year for Daredevil, so why don't we jump in and let's talk about the spotlight for this week.
Sounds good.
This week's spotlight story.
All right, Dwayne. So, you've got a spotlight book for us. I am looking forward to this one. Sad stuff. You've picked a somber book for us, but I think a really good one. So.
Yes. We're going to talk about Daredevil number 220. It's from July 1985, and the issue is called Fog. Book starts out at 3 a.m. Matt Murdock gets a call for help from his former fiancée, Heather Glenn. Matt Murdock says he can't find a cab at this time of night, especially in this fog, which, by the way, looks absolutely gorgeous. You see some panels right there at the beginning showing what sort of foggy night this actually is, and it looks just fantastic. Heather urges him to come to her as Daredevil, and on the way, Daredevil hears a couple, Manny and Doris, who are in an argument. He doesn't intervene and proceeds on to help Heather. He finds Heather unconscious from drinking. She wakes up, and then she continues drinking and doesn't appear to be in any real danger. So Murdock and Daredevil's like, why am I here? Why are you calling me at this time of night? And she says that she's lonely. And yeah, he doesn't really want anything to deal with this. So as Matt leaves, he sees a man walking and smoking a foreign brand of cigarettes, which to me at that point didn't really mean anything. But it turns out, as you've noted before, if they show you a gun on the mantle, there's a reason they're showing you the gun on the mantle. So
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So Matt doesn't investigate the man as he senses there's more trouble with Manny and Doris. He finds that Manny has fatally stabbed Doris. He punches out Manny and then leaves him for the police. Matt knows that if he ignored Heather's drunken call for help, Doris would still be alive. And that's where we end things for the night, at least. And I have to tell you, this is a really weird sort of setup, because I'm like, there's something really odd about what's going on here and what's at play, what's been set up, that I wasn't quite sure where this was going. But Dan, what did you think of the story so far? And what did you have any expectations as to what this was going to lead to?
Well, I mean, I'd have to go back a while to be able to, remember when I didn't know what it was going to lead up to. But I know that it frustrated me. It frustrates me now to read it, because Daredevil is so unkind to Heather Glenn for so long. Not just in this book, but all the way back. I mean, basically, she was the daughter of a guy who ran a company, inherited the company, and was going to be a successful woman, and he made her give up the company, wrecked the company, then said he was going to marry her, then said he wasn't going to marry her, and basically just left without saying goodbye. And just terrible way to treat another human being. So then she calls, he goes over there, finds her passed out, and he's like, well, looks like she's going to live. I guess I'll just leave now. And then, and he's angry because, yes, there was somebody else who needed help, but there's always going to be somebody else who needed help. And if his friends need help, it's not their fault that they got in the way of him, going out and meddling in other people's business. So I was unhappy with Matt from the beginning on all of this, and I continue to be as things proceed. But hopefully it'll all be all right, and he'll make things better.
Yikes. That's not entirely
Magic 8 Ball
yeah.
points to no.
Yes.
So
the narrator, things do not end well.
No.
The next, and we find out just how not well they end the very next morning, because Foggy calls Matt and tells him that Heather has hung herself in her apartment, which is just terrible, because that was how her father died.
Mm-hmm.
In a jail cell. He hung himself because he got basically mind controlled by the Blue Man and forced into doing things that he wouldn't have done otherwise, and everything, and didn't remember why. He just knew that he had done the things that he was kind of being charged for. And yeah, as you said, this relationship with Heather and Matt Murdock has not gone well. And to see her take that way out was just, it was really, really rough.
Yeah, and interestingly, just like Matt was incidentally, it was like Matt deciding to intervene ended up getting Elektra's father killed to a certain extent, because if it wasn't for him invading, he probably wouldn't have stood up and got shot by the cops. Similarly, it was Matt's investigations into the company that led to Heather's father getting caught and eventually dying as well. So he's not only toxic to the women in his life, but to their dads as well, evidently. So
Matt Murdock later investigates the crime scene as Daredevil and notes that some items from her safe were missing. Or are missing, I guess. He and Foggy recall how a European businessman, Silvio Giulio, was inquiring about buying some patents from Heather when her father died. Using information from his informants, Grotto and Turk, Matt investigates and confronts Silvio and his bodyguards. He defeats them and then captures Silvio. As he questions the businessman at police headquarters, he admits to stealing those patents, but that Heather was already dead when his men had arrived. Later, Foggy gets a note from Heather that she had mailed previously, wanting Foggy to tell Matt that she was sorry. Matt feels responsible. Foggy tells him that Matt is only guilty of not loving Heather as much as Heather loved him. Yet Matt still feels responsible, which I think we would both agree that he probably is, at least partially to maybe very much responsible.
I mean, obviously a lot of bad things happened. Nothing's ever all one person's fault, and obviously, everyone has responsibility for how they react to things. That said, the way he, especially when he's at the crime scene and he sees that something's weird and he's like, oh, the safe has been tampered with. She was killed. It's not my fault. And then suddenly he's okay with it. He's like, oh, well, wasn't my fault. I guess I'll just go solve this murder and then everything will be good. So he's a little weird. There are times where, and I think that's become one of the reasons I like Matt Murdock as a character, is because they let you not like Matt Murdock as a character on a regular basis, especially early on. He is a deeply flawed dude who, especially in terms of his relationships with other people, like, even Foggy, he never really treats that well. The way that multiple times, even this year, Foggy's like, man, we're going bankrupt. We really should do something about this. And, Murdoch's like, oh, yeah, I got to go. I'm not going to tell you why, but I'm not going to be working today.
Wow.
And so it is frustrating.
So that basically ends the story. The book actually ends with a quote from the Apology of Socrates by Plato. It says, "Now it is time we are going, I to die and you to live, but which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God." I think it was a really interesting way to end this particular story, given everything that has happened.
No. Yeah, it was strange. I do think also that Mazzucchelli's emerging sort of skill made this a lot more difficult to read as well, because especially when you saw Heather, she did look just so defeated, and it was really well done. You could see the emotion and kind of the pain there. So I really thought the art notched it up a level in this book, and at a certain point that when you read that Mazzucchelli is, even though O'Neill is a sort of a, what we call him, I guess he's one of the old masters sort of the comic arts. He's been doing this since the 60s. But Mazzucchelli is operating at a higher level than him right here, because he is producing art that O'Neill's prose is not really matching up with at this point. He's giving us confusing quotes from Plato, and Mazzucchelli's kicking us right in the nuts. And it's not an equal distribution,
Yeah.
So...
to your point, I know that I specifically have been pretty critical of the Heather Glenn character since she was first introduced. But I would not want to. I felt bad, like really bad, seeing how she ended up in this book, and then seeing we have a panel where we see part of her
Yep.
her end, and it is, seeing her that night before, and then seeing her that next day. It's just so difficult. And to your point, the art was just, I think, makes it so tough to look at. It just is. It's tough. It's so rough.
So what do we learn from this? Of course, that yet again, you never want to be the character who isn't integral to the long-term story, who learns the hero's secret identity, because once you know it, you are a loose end to be tied up by the writers at some point in the relatively near future. You're either going to be mind wiped or you're going to be killed. And I guess there's really no way around that. So, unfortunately, that is what they decided to do with Heather as well.
You've talked a little bit, like when we were going through the Frank Miller books, you talked about kind of some of the guilty feelings that Daredevil has and how he was starting to sort of express some of those feelings. And he definitely expresses some feelings of guilt in this book as well. But part of me wonders if this is going to matter. Like, is this going to be something that actually is going to change the character? He's felt guilty before now, and it hasn't really resulted in a lot of change. And so I wonder if that's going to be where this ultimately ends up this time, too.
Well, I mean, we do have that problem that the whole job of a comic character is to do the soap opera thing, which is to have the illusion of changing constantly while never actually changing, right? So, that said, I think that O'Neill didn't really get the memo in terms of sort of that Catholic guilt type of thing that Miller brought in. Miller would have chewed this up a lot more in terms of Matt beating himself up over it, right? And what Miller started doing really was, with the whole Bullseye thing. Bullseye kills people this issue. 4 or 5 issues later, you can still see Daredevil sitting around in the wee hours of the night thinking about that equation of should he have just killed Bullseye because now these people are dead. And I don't think that O'Neill will get that reflective with the character for the most part. But it'll come back later. The Heather Glenn situation is now there and ready to be taken on by a writer who actually wants to make that, a part of things. So, but no, I don't think that the guilty feels doesn't seem to have the same weight that it did when we were looking at the way that Miller was dealing with it a couple of years ago.
Makes sense. Speaking of Miller, there was actually a special thank you to Frank Miller that was on the title page of this story as well, which I thought was interesting insofar as then it felt like a very Miller-esque sort of story that occurred after that. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, the timing of all that. But I think that does wrap up our talk on the spotlight for this week. Dan, why don't we talk the takeaway for 1980? This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, if we're going to look at the 1985 as a whole, what should we take away this year?
So I'm sad to say, but the cynical side of me says that the takeaway that Marvel and much of the industry got from this year is that quality counts less than you'd think it might. That in actual fact, you look at something like Secret Wars or Secret Wars 2, and there's something about putting something out and saying, hey, this is our big event and it's cool, and the lemmings will just come and buy, and even if the event isn't really all that good, it still ends up selling crazy numbers and then getting a sequel. And so Secret Wars and Secret Wars 2, and this is not the end of Secret Wars entirely, by the way, is a little bit depressing. But what we're going to see is that sort of just that shoveling of content begins at Marvel over these years. We've seen a little bit of it already, but previously they did reprint stuff, etc. So now they're just finding ways to put out whatever they can. And a lot of the things that I really like end up getting canceled. And a lot of the things that I find are really questionable end up sticking around. And it sort of makes me a little grumpy. We see some of the things that get canceled, and it's kind of like, I'm not so sure about that. Now, there's some like Kristar the Crystal Warrior. I understand entirely why it got canceled, right?
Yeah.
But there's also other books that fall into disrepair or that get canceled where I'm like, man, somebody should have given that more of a shot. Like, how does Moon Knight end up getting canceled? Because it was, even at the point where it was canceled last year, it was a pretty good book, but it couldn't hold on. And there was a lot of stuff that was not nearly as good as that ended up remaining for years. So overall, as we move into the next few years and decades, you're going to have that same problem that, if you remember, we had with TV shows through much of the 90s and the like. When Arrested Development gets canceled, and everybody's like, but this is the best show on television, why is it getting canceled? Well, because the people who are filling out the Nielsen ratings are not the people who are necessarily thinking the same way that you are, right? That there are different ways for things to get judged. And a lot of this now comes down to investment and people seeing, like a trend and following it or whatever. And so we get a lot of books that are really questionable surviving, and a lot of books that I really loved that we're going to see die out a lot sooner than they should. So, for instance, that Cloak and Dagger series this year, I thought was really good. I thought it deserved to make it more than the 11 books that it went. I enjoyed Swords of the Swashbucklers. I would like to have seen that gone longer. I didn't need a third Spider-Man title, but I was outvoted on that. So, such is the way. And Webb was actually pretty good, I will note. But in any case, I think that over the next couple of years, as you see us talk about what's coming in and what's leaving, there's going to be some things that may puzzle you, if you remember. We're like, man, that was really good. Why did it get canceled? And that was crap. Why did it last 50 issues? And such is the way of it. So
that's a little rough takeaway for this year, but yeah, something to definitely.
You didn't have to read. You didn't have to read Secret Wars 2. You just had to hear my sadness over it. It could have been worse. So.
Yes, it. I guess it definitely could have. That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.